We'll read Luke chapter 1, verses 5 to 10, and then a bit later on, verses 21 to 23. In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. We find in the Old Testament of the Bible that God told the Israelites how they could approach him. Their approach to God was through priests. Priests would have access to God and represent the people to him. In fact, this system was set up such that all the priests were descended from one man, a man called Aaron. 1,000 years before these events took place that we're reading about, King Solomon had a temple built in Jerusalem. All the people of Israel were expected to come to the temple to worship God at particular times. King David, Solomon's father, had organized the building before he died, and he also set up 24 families of priests to take it in turns to serve in the temple for a period. What we've just read took place just over a year before Jesus was born. We know that Israel was part of the Roman Empire at that time, and that a man called Herod, he's now called Herod the Great, had been appointed by the Romans to be king in Jerusalem. Well, we've read about Zechariah. He was one of the priests. He was married to a woman called Elizabeth, and sadly for them, although they'd wanted children, Elizabeth had been unable to have children, and now they were too old. We learn too that they did what was right before God. This doesn't mean they were perfect, nobody is, but this description strongly implies that they tried to be obedient to God, and if they realized that they had done wrong, they would tell God about it immediately. They confess it to him, knowing that he is a forgiving God. They were blameless in holding God's commandments, so no one could say, well, they've done this or that wrong and haven't sorted it out. There were no wrong things hanging over them that they hadn't dealt with. Well, Zechariah belonged to one of these 24 families of priests that David had set up, and he'd been chosen randomly from that family to perform priestly duties in the temple. I'm sure that this was considered as a very great privilege. And while he was doing his job, there were crowds of people outside, crowds of worshippers, as was usual. Now, something happened in the temple which we will talk about in our next recording, but let's go forward now to verses 21 to 23. And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they wondered at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them, and they realized that he'd seen a vision in the temple, and he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. Well, the people outside had a shock. He didn't come out of the temple. So what was going on? Well, I imagine they got quite restive. They probably began to worry. We don't know what was going on through their minds. I imagine that some of them were wondering whether he even could have died in there. Eventually he did appear. That must have been a relief to the crowd. He was clearly expected to say something. Now, I think that his duty was to pray with the people before they returned home, but he couldn't speak. All he could do was gesture with his hands. The crowd began to understand. They may not have completely worked out what had happened in the temple, but somehow he managed to get across that it must have been something very extraordinary. He was unable to speak, but he did manage to complete his time of service in the temple, and then he returned home, but still unable to speak. As I said, we'll consider what happened in the temple in the next recording. Here's something for us to think about. None of us are perfect. But do we really aim to be righteous before God and to be blameless so that no one has good reason to complain about us?